Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of 5 memoirs that I've read over the past couple of weeks. The first one that I'm going to mention was also my favorite of the 5, and it was one that I listened to the audio version of. And that was Saeed Jones's How We Fight for Our Lives. The audio version of this is read by the author himself. It's interesting, this is marketed as being a coming-of-age story about the author's growing up being black and gay in the United States. But beyond that, I think the real major theme in this is about the author's relationship with his mother and his grandmother. And their relationship is at certain points touching, at certain points infuriating. Growing up, the author spent his summers with his grandmother, and his grandmother was an evangelical Christian, and his mother was someone who had converted to Buddhism. And his grandmother both didn't approve of his mother's religion and didn't kind of approve of his sexuality. So there were complications to that relationship, but there's still a lot of love in that. And it's just, I feel like it's rare to read a memoir that's so dedicated to one's family when the family relationship is complicated in a way that I think other writers wouldn't be as nuanced about. Which is not to say forgiving, because that's not really the theme that we're going through. It is much less glib than I think a lot of memoirs would be about this kind of topic, because there are a lot of memoirs where people discuss issues with their families and how they got past them, but that's not what this is. This is just humans being human in a way that's almost poetic. And the author does write poetry, but this isn't poetic in the kind of intentionally confusing way that I think there are a lot of poets who write a memoir and it is written like that. That's not this. This is very straightforward, but it allows everybody to have their own piece of humanity, not just in relationship to him, which I thought was brilliant. This was just a really great family memoir, and I highly recommend the audio version because it was very engaging to listen to it, to hear. I almost wanted to say recited instead of narrated because, again, it does have that kind of poetic feel to it. Next up is another family memoir, but this is one that I had a fairly mixed reaction to. And that is Sopan Debs' Mistranslations, Meeting the Immigrant Parents Who Raised Me. Sopan Deb is a journalist primarily, but also a stand-up comedian. And in this book, he, I almost said interrogates, but interviews his parents. He was someone who had become essentially inadvertently estranged from his family. He went a series of years without speaking to his parents. His mother actually lived fairly close by, even though he was in no contact with them. His father he fell out of touch with because his father up and moved to India suddenly and called him one day and said, "Oh yeah, I'm in India." So this follows the author as he gets to know his parents, or gets to re-meet his parents, over the course of about a year and a half. Because I am a fairly nosy person, I really enjoyed that style of family memoir where the author is digging into their parents' past. And that is what the author does here. As he interviews them, I was fascinated. However, as a memoir, because this is something that happened 2 years ago and he's reflecting on it, presumably a year ago when he was writing this, there isn't really a lot of time between these conversations where he gets to know his parents and the resolution of the book. So this is again one of those memoirs. I find that I say this quite frequently about memoirs, that it felt like we needed a few more years for the ending to really feel like a proper resolution, or it should have just been about the interviews without the "we all lived happily ever after" type final chapter that this has, because there just hasn't been enough time passing from that. The other issue that I had with this is very subjective, so your mileage may vary. I'm not a fan of his comedy, and he does insert a lot of humor in this book, and for most of it, I rolled my eyes. He does a lot of ethnic humor, but it's very broad. So he will say things like, "brown people do this," when really the stereotype that he should be using is, "Hindu Bengali people from New Jersey do this." Something like that. Like, I would always prefer ethnic humor to be really narrow. I guess the comparison would be somebody like Sugar Sammy or Russell Peters, or someone who has very narrow ethnic humor as opposed to broad. "Brown people do this, Christians do this, blah blah blah." Like, it's too broad for any of that to be true, so it's only funny if your reality is that stereotype. But because it's such a broad stereotype, it just doesn't play right, at least to me. If you are from New Jersey, I think the stereotypes might fit better for you, possibly, but the humor just didn't work for me because I spent a lot of time saying, "That's not even a true stereotype, how can that be funny?" But I'm sure for a lot of people it is a true stereotype, and you would laugh. I just found it kind of eye-rolly, a lot of it. But if you're nosy about people's lives, I do recommend this because it is really interesting to see him interview his parents and figure out their backstories. So, next up is a book that did something that I'm very pleased about, which is that it discusses a pivotal emotional moment in the author's life, but a decade after the fact, which is nice to see because it means that when there are reflective pieces, it feels a little more earned. I'm always distracted by something that's presented as this big pivotal moment when it's only a year or two later, because how do you know that it was so pivotal if it's only a year or two later? In any case, this is Tyler Federer's Dancing at the Pity Party, a dead mom graphic memoir. This details mostly the year when she was 18 and 19, when her mother was diagnosed with late-stage cancer and eventually passes away. And it goes through both the mourning period. Her family is Jewish, so they have a religious mourning period, but then also in the natural progression of her mourning as she goes back to university and deals with friends and talks about their relationships with their parents. And I thought this was very well done, and I think it might not have been as well done if this had been written earlier. The style is very brightly colored, so that is interesting because often this kind of style of memoir is done in black and white in graphic memoirs, so I was curious to see this. I did think it worked pretty well, and especially with regard to the way that she talks about her mother's style, and I thought the art matched that really interestingly. So yeah, this was very well done. She does make some generalizations about this is how you can tell when someone lost a parent at a young age, and I didn't think that those were necessarily accurate, or at least weren't true to my experience, which made me think, yeah, you can't generalize like that. But that is a pretty minor complaint in this, and I did think this was very interesting. So, and I did learn a lot about Jewish mourning, because I didn't know anything about that before. Oh, and I will say, I was very pleased with the fact that I didn't end up rolling my eyes at a lot of her university sections, because I've read a number of books lately that have made me think, I don't want to read any more memoirs from Americans who talk about their college or university experience, because they're all very similar. It doesn't seem to matter how old, what generation they are, if they're male or female, what their cultural background is. They're all kind of same, and I'm kind of tired of it. But that one didn't have the same focus that a lot of them did, so that worked for me a little better than usual. Next up, I have another graphic memoir, and that is Malaka Gharib's I Was Their American Dream. This is basically a recounting of her childhood. She grew up in California with her mother, who was Filipino, and spent her summers going to Egypt to visit her father, who was Egyptian and moved back to Egypt after her parents divorced. And it kind of goes through both her childhood growing up and then at university when she moved to the eastern United States and dealt with, in her town where she grew up in California, it was mostly people who were also from recent immigrant backgrounds, and then she moves to the East Coast and has other experiences. She marries a white American Southerner and talks about their cultural food experiences and things. If I'm talking about this in a very general way, it's because it is not very focused. It's a lot of this happened, then this happened, then this happened, but there doesn't feel like an overarching, here's the point. And on the one hand, I prefer that to the books that are talking about something recent or something that hasn't really been reflected on in a sudden reflective way, but it did leave me kind of thinking, what is the point? Except to share a story. And again, I'm nosy, so I like to hear everybody's stories, but if you were looking for a solid progression of plot, you're just not going to get that with this. The art style, also to tie in with the title, uses a red, white, and blue format, which I didn't think worked. It does mean that a third of everybody has either red or blue hair, which in a book that's so focused on appearance and ethnicity, because that's one of the comments that she gets in her, she grows up in a neighborhood where there are a lot of other Filipinos, but they don't recognize her as Filipino because she looks quite a bit like her Egyptian father, and this is a whole thing. But because it's drawn in this ultra stylized way, it strips some of that away. And in some books, that would feel very intentional, but here it feels like it's a side effect. Like the art was going for one thing and the writing was going for another, and they don't really merge together. Now, that said, I did think that this was very kind of relatable, in that if you are also somebody who has parents from two different countries and then you grew up in a third, I think regardless of what three countries they are, because my three are not the same as hers three, but a lot of this was very recognizable. So that was fun, but as a package, I didn't think it completely worked. So your mileage may vary, because if you're looking for a story, that's not this. But if you're nosy, or if you find any of the elements of this relatable, I do think it works on that basis. So. And finally, I have a book that, I don't know why I put this on hold at the library, because it's not really my thing, but I did see a lot of people recommend it, so I think I just did based on that and didn't do enough research. This is R. Eric Thomas's Here for It. He is a writer for Elle.com and sort of writes humorous pop culture reflections for them. And this is a collection of mostly memoir-y essays, and again, very humor-based. However, similarly to the other humor-adjacent book that I mentioned, his sense of humor is pretty corny to me, so I really should have read some of his articles before picking this up, because genuinely, the first time I laughed was page 195. And I feel like in a book with such a strong humor focus, you should laugh earlier. Now, again, humor is super subjective, so if you like his writing on Elle.com or on Twitter, you will probably enjoy this much, much, much more than I did. For me, I found this eye-rolling to the extreme, and because a lot of the stories were kind of cutesy, it didn't fulfill my nosy side, which in a lot of memoirs, even if I'm not enjoying the writing or the humor or the reflective bits that I think are not always done well, at least you get the satisfaction of hearing somebody's stories. But these are presented in a way that suggests that they're always slightly exaggerated, so it wasn't particularly satisfying that way either. So this is one I probably should not have picked up. Now again, I said this with a book a while ago that I didn't really get along with. Under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have finished this, but my dog is old, I spent more time at the vet. Because of COVID, you sit in your car, you don't go in with them, so I was reading this book in the car. I didn't enjoy this, but you may love it if you love his humor, because this is absolutely the kind of thing that is very subjective, and it is far closer to humor essays than memoir essays, even though it's presented in a kind of memoir-esque way in the marketing. So, there we go. So those are the 5 most recent memoirs that I've read, or listened to in the one case. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought. I'd also love to hear how you feel about humor writing that's humor hybrid writing, humor essays, humor memoir, where your sense of humor just doesn't quite mesh with the author's sense of humor. I'd love to know how you judge or rank that kind of thing. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.